Thank you very much, Branko, that you've taken the time to speak with us, and the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew. Actually, I would like to thank Brave New Europe for an incredible job that you guys have been doing now for years. We don't have too many outlets of sanity anymore, so you are one of them. And I do hope that, of course, you guys continue working so well. And of course, I would like to thank everybody else who has participated, including, you mentioned, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and especially Oscar and Florian, who will be translating. And please do interrupt me when I tend to go too fast, because I sometimes speak too fast, and I will try to be more moderate today. As you know, the topic today is the most recent developments in global inequality and the political consequences. The title here is a little bit different because I really would like to start with a historical overview. It's not going to take too long, and I would still stay within the time that Matthew allotted me, but I think it's important to realize how global inequality, to the extent that we know, because obviously the numbers from the 2 centuries ago are much more tentative than what we have today. Even today's numbers are being contested, and there are many disagreements, but you can imagine how it is when you go back to 1820s. This is a quote from Fernand Braudel, so you can read it. I will not going to read it myself, but essentially, inequality of the world is the result of structural realities. And those realities, as Braudel says, are first slow to take shape, but they are also very slow to fade away. So let me show you how, to the best our knowledge, how global inequality looks actually over the period of 2 centuries. First, I would like to be very clear about what I mean by global inequality. Global inequality technically is inequality in incomes, not wealth, but incomes, meaning the annual amounts of revenues from labor, capital, self-employment, and so forth that people receive. And it treats technically every individual in the world equally. So you can imagine that the idea behind these numbers is to have incomes of all the families in the world, to divide that family income by the number of people living in each family, and then to line up individuals by their family, what is called household per capita income. It is obviously an enormous task. We do approximations, and we do it in a more recent period when we have the data using household surveys. But still, it's an enormous task. But in the past, we obviously had even much less data, and quite a lot of these numbers are sort of guesswork based on much better knowledge about GDP per capita and fairly kind of elementary knowledge about income inequality in the 19th century in different countries. Now, having said all of that, I will not talk more and more about the data, and I think maybe some of you might raise this issue when we discuss in the Q&A, but let's take the data as given and look at what the numbers show us. Here you have on a vertical axis the Gini coefficient, which is a typical measure of inequality, and it ranges from 0, which theoretically when everybody has the same income, to a number 100, which also is a theoretical number, where like one person, one family would take all the income of the country or of the world. Now, you notice that in 1820, when our numbers start, global inequality is estimated at around 55 Gini points. It's a high number, but not really an extravagantly high number. If you look at individual countries today, like, for example, countries like Colombia or Honduras or Brazil would have a Gini of approximately 55. So it's something unequal, but not extravagant. Now, what you notice is that throughout the entire 19th century, and also through the first half of the 20th century, you basically have an increase in global inequality. and we reach a number which is more than 70 Gini points. Now, that number is really high. There is no country which would have a Gini of 70 points. So the world is and was extremely unequal. I will come in a second to the reasons behind that increase of inequality. Then you notice that in the second half of the 20th century, inequality remains in that very, very high number of 70. Slight decline already by the last decade of the 20th century, and now we really enter with much better data compared to the past. And then finally, in the last 30 years approximately, we have a significant decline in global inequality, which is due to the rise of Asia. So I will explain how the rise of Asia actually is reducing inequality, the role of China in particular, and then let's look again historically what is behind this change. Now, this is the same graph like I showed you before, but now this graph takes each data point and divides that data point into two parts. The blue part is inequality, global inequality, which is due to inequalities between countries in the world. So this is really basically looking at how much inequality there would be if the only inequality were to exist between the states, between the countries. So everybody within a country would have theoretically the same income. So let me explain clearly what the blue bar is. Take the European Union. The blue bar would only represent inequality between individual countries. Let's suppose Germany versus Bulgaria, Germany versus Romania, Romania versus the Netherlands, Netherlands versus France, where you would actually only use the mean incomes of those countries and number of people. So you totally ignore inequality within nation states. Now, what is actually striking in this graph, if you look at the 19th century, is that the blue bar, which is inequality between nation states, was quite small before the Industrial Revolution. And it was small because the gaps between different countries, rich countries like the Netherlands and the UK, and very poor countries like Ceylon in those days, or China, were to the order of 3-to-1, 4-to-1. As you know, nowadays, the gaps between the top richest countries and the poorest countries, even leaving aside countries like Luxembourg and United Arab Emirates, if you take the US and compare it with the Congo, the ratio is more than 100-to-1. So in other words, what was relatively equal distribution in terms of country mean incomes, which is reflected in the blue bar, has changed in the 19th century because during the 19th century, as you know, you had on one hand countries of the West, which became richer, and on the other hand, large countries like India and China that stagnated, or even in the case of China, became poorer. So the blue bar, which goes up throughout the 19th century and all the way to 1993 in this graph, is really driven by the rising between country incomes. And actually, it is the main force for the increase in global inequality. Now, what you see more recently from 1993 or 1998, you see the blue bar going down. And this blue bar goes down principally on account of Chinese growth, but also India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and other Asian countries that were relatively poor, that had, actually some of them absolutely poor as well. They had lots of people, and they are catching up, meaning that their rate of growth is higher than the rate of growth of the rich countries. So the blue bar is then shrinking. And this is the effect of the rise of Asia that I mentioned in the very beginning. Then you look at the red bar or the orange bar. Now, the orange bar is the opposite. It actually gives you the sum of total sum of inequalities within nation states. And here too, you see in the 19th century, the rising red bar. And then when you look at the 19th century, you see global inequality being driven by two powerful forces. On the one hand, countries diverge by their mean income, pushing up the blue bar. And within each country, there is a divergence between the rich and the poor people, pushing up the red bar. So you have two forces. The force, what I call the age of empires, because basically that's what it was from the international perspective. And you have the age of class struggle, because the class division or class differences within nation states increased. Then when you look at the second part of the 20th century, you see that in the level of inequality is extremely high, which we have seen before. But both of these forces are no longer working as clearly. The force of international inequality between nation states is now basically stable. And the force of within national inequalities is even becoming less important. As you know, there was significant decline in within national inequalities since 1950s in most of capitalist countries, but also significant decline of inequality in countries like China that went through communist revolution, or in East European countries, like take Hungary or Poland, that had large landed estates, which basically were taken over. So then we finally come to the present period, which is sort of a mirror image of what happened in the 19th century, but mirror image, like in a mirror, it's the same, but it's the opposite, if I can put it like that. It's the same in the sense that you do have one part of the world, in this case Asia, catching up or going faster ahead. But since that part of the world was poor, there is a catch-up element which then reduces the international inequality. And on the other hand, within nation states, we generally had, in the most recent period, an increase in inequalities, which explains to some extent the red bar now being longer than it was like 30 years ago. So this is essentially a story, and I think really, I'm sure there will be some questions on that, but I really would like you to think of global inequality as having gone through three different eras. The era where both within and between country inequality was up, the era where the level was extremely high, the between country inequality remained very high. That was the era of the three worlds: the first world of capitalist rich countries, the second world of socialist countries, and the third world of Asia and Africa, and to a little bit less extent, Latin America. And finally, the third era, which is today, which is the rise of Asia. So it is actually to that third era that actually I would like to go and spend some time explaining what happened now. But as I said, I think it's important to keep in mind the entire historical context. In other words, we don't start from 1990 or 2000. We really start from essentially the Industrial Revolution that has transformed the world. Now, the rise of Asia, you have seen similar graphs. I mean, obviously, China overtaking the United States in terms of international dollars already since 2015. The graphs here show you on the left-hand side the size of each economy in total global GDP. So what the US, China, what you can see here is the Chinese GDP now is more than 20% of the global GDP. For the US, the share of the US is 18% approximately. But as you notice here, the US after the war was 40% of the global GDP. So that was a very unusual situation that one country with 4% of the population had 40% of the global GDP. Now, there's another nice graph here, which is not that well known, is when you compare India and Germany. So notice that India and Germany around 1960, were more or less of the same size. Their total economies in the world were about the same size. Germany became more important because it grew much more fast, and particularly because China was not growing fast. And German share was about 7% of global GDP. Well, nowadays, German share is 3% of global GDP, which is also a reflection, as you will see that later, on what happens to Europe within the global context. India, on the other hand, had hit the bottom in 1980 with about 3% of the global GDP. So all the production of the entire country of India of more than 1 billion people was only 3% of GDP of the world. Well, now it is 8%. So, you can see again, this really very significant change in positions between Europe and Asia. And this is essentially what is going to drive most of my rest of my talk, is actually to show you a remarkable reshuffling in relative income positions that has occurred over the last 30 years. What I mean by reshuffling is that if you were to line up people in percentiles from the poorest to the richest, what has happened is that essentially the Chinese percentiles, Chinese groups of people have gone up the global scale, the global income distribution. But as people go up and they get ahead of the others, clearly somebody has to go down. We are talking here about ranks. And as you will see that in a minute, people who did go down were essentially lower middle classes and middle classes of rich countries. And this is actually the story that in a nutshell of what happened in the last 30 years. Now, this is the world distribution. I will not go into all the details, but what is actually interesting here to observe is that by 2018, where actually my data end, you look at the world distribution and it looks much more symmetrical than it used to be 30 years ago. And it looks more symmetrical because there is more of the global middle class. This is not the global middle, this is not the middle class in the Western sense, because these people are much poorer, but it is a global class in a global sense because they're in the middle of the income distribution, and there is much greater thickness in the middle of the distribution compared to the past. So the reflection of that change in the distribution is something that you have seen probably, and I would go very quickly over that. It is the so-called elephant graph that was originally produced by Christoph Lackner and myself. And that graph, the objective of that graph was to look at what percentiles of global income distribution there was the largest increase in income between the period 1988 and 2008. Now, we were very lucky. It was not, by some design, but Christoph and I basically ended up with 20 years, which are very important. Bookends are very important. 1988 is, as you know, just a year before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 2008 is the year of the global financial crisis. So that was the period of what you might call the high globalization. And that period was characterized with something that we all implicitly knew, but until Christoph and I produced these numbers, it was known, but it was could not be documented empirically. So what you see in these numbers is that when you look at on the vertical axis, which gives you the cumulative growth over that period of 20 years, people who did very well are people at point A, Asian middle classes, and people at point C, the global top 1%. Who did very poorly? People at point B, where most of the Western middle classes are located. So the graph was very successful, and actually there are even two books that basically discuss only the graph, the political implications of the graph, because the political implications of the graph are very striking. If you are a Western government and you believe in this graph, and you say, okay, I should do something about point B, because point B means that my my middle classes have not grown much. They are still relatively rich. Notice the point 80. They are at the 80th global percentile. So globally, they are rich, but they are not growing. And then you basically have two solutions, or you have two culprits. One culprit, you can say, is point A. Chinese have grown too fast. So should I then undo globalization? Should I do something to stop China? And this is the theme which was started by Trump, as you know, in the United States with the trade war. And that was a fringe position. But that has now become a sort of a, middle of the road, mainstream position, is that globalization is benefiting too much China and India and others, and it's not benefiting the middle classes of the rich world, and consequently, we need to do something about it. Most recently, Financial Times economist Rana Farooqar called for French shoring. In other words, breaking globalization as such into mercantilist blocks. But it's all driven by that particular perception and the fact that Chinese middle classes and people in China have grown faster than the middle classes in the Western world. A different political interpretation of this graph is to focus on the contradiction between points B and C, because you can say the problem, yes, is that the point B has not grown very much, but it's not that the main reason is not that the Chinas of this world have grown. The main reason is that the domestic situation has been such that the very top people at the top 1%, whether it be German or English or British or of the US, have benefited from tax advantages, from ability to outsource things, from ability to to avoid taxation. And then really the main action in that case should be to redistribute things nationally. So these are the two options I'm putting in a very stark way, but obviously they could work together, but these are really the two options that were politically envisaged by sort of when people got aware of the consequences of high globalization. Now, after the financial crisis, however, things have not remained the same. After the financial crisis, the top 1% in the rich countries in terms of income has not recovered and has not grown the way it grew during the high globalization. In the case of the US, which actually is very heavily represented at that global top, simply because US is a very rich country and it's a very unequal country. So about 11% of American population is in the global top 1%. Or to put it differently, the global top 1% is composed of one half of the people in the global top percent are American. They have not recovered because the global financial crisis really led to their decline in real incomes. And then there was a recovery period, but the rate of growth overall was quite slow. What has continued in the next 10-year, this is 5-year period, 70, another 5-year period. What has continued is that in the middle, the growth rate has remained high because of China, India, and the rest of Asia. Western middle classes have not grown fast. And finally, there was a slow growth at the top. So this is why, and let me show you this slide, you had a change in the most recent 10 years. While the high globalization was characterized by the elephant graph that I've already shown you, but that I now sort of simply redo on this graph with the blue line, the most recent period has not been characterized by the increased rate of growth among the very top. But it has remained characterized by, it has remained the case that the middle classes of the Asian countries have continued to grow very fast, as you can see on this graph, by something like 7 or 8% per year.
Branko, I'm changing the interpreters at this moment.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You can carry on then.
So that was the change in the second part of globalization. Now, I would now say something about what we can expect in the future, which is actually very sort of part of the guesswork because we are really experiencing three simultaneous big crises that are going on and that are, obviously, since they are going on, we don't know what will be the ultimate effect. And that's why I'm actually very, I should say, concerned and pessimistic about the future, because the three big crises are the crisis of COVID, which started at the end of 2019, and we don't see the end to that either, although we thought we saw the light at the end of the tunnel, but as you have seen recently in China, the situation has become much worse again. Then we have this underlying conflict between the US and China, which can at least derail the entire globalization or could even lead to a war. And then finally, and this is the conflict that really has no apparent solution that we can see now since it has become a sort of a mainstream position. And then finally, we have a hot war between two large armies in practically middle of Europe, the war between Ukraine and Russia, for which we also do not see the end, and whose effect not only is huge on the countries, on the belligerents, but whose effect on the prices of energy, on the prices of food, on military production, which I think is generally wasteful, but now there will be higher share of GDP, which will be dedicated to that, and consequently less would be for civilian purposes. So it has really an extremely negative global effect. And these are the three crises which actually makes it very difficult for us or to anybody to predict how globally the situation would evolve. So before I finish, I just wanted to say a few words about the changes that we know have happened and to explain that reshuffling of global income positions over the last 30 years. I mentioned before that the reshuffling is, you can imagine, let me put it like that. Imagine that people are lined up so that everybody sort of knows his or her position in the global income distribution. So you are number 69th percentile, or number 82, which is higher, or number 100, which means that you're in a global top 1%. Or maybe your number is like 32, which is you're relatively low in the global income distribution. Historically, because of what we have seen before, with high growth rates of Western countries and stagnation of India and China and Africa, the West has essentially been filling the top 20%. People who are actually considered poor in the Netherlands would be at the 80th global percentile. So they see themselves as poor because, for example, within Netherlands, they may be poor, but globally they are not. Globally, they're at the 80th percentile. Now, what is happening now is that some of these people in West European, in European countries or in the West more generally, are being overtaken by the rising Asian middle classes. So let me show you how it looks in real numbers. Here on the left, you have the Chinese urban deciles. There are 10 of them, obviously. And then you look at their global income percentile, where they were in 1988. So in 1988, this blue line shows you that the poorest urban percentile, poorest urban decile in China was approximately the 15th global percent. Obviously, the people who were at the top decile in China were at around 70th global percent. Everybody got better off in China. So the red line just is now dominating the blue line. So it's no surprise. We are not, this is nothing new. The new part, however, is when the Chinese go up, the relative position of somebody else has to go down. And look at the slide for Italy. The red line, particularly for the lower Italian deciles, is now much inferior, much lower than it was 30 years ago. And the reason is essentially that the Asian middle classes have moved into that range And as they overtake the Italians who were at the lower income deciles in Italy, these people in Italy fall backwards in global income distribution. People at the Italian top are not affected because they are far, and still the rise of China doesn't affect them. The rise of China might affect them in 20 years, but not now. The same story with Germany here on the left. I started with 93 for Germany because of the unification. Again, you see the same thing. At the bottom of the income distribution in Germany, you see a decline in the relative position of those people. A very nice example is Poland. Poland is probably the most successful transition country. Very high rate of growth among the entire population, poor people, middle income people, rich people. Now, how come that even the Polish lower national deciles have deteriorated globally? They have deteriorated globally because Poland had a very good growth rate compared to the rest of Europe. But these deciles there in Poland have to compete with Chinese deciles. And China has grown at 7 or 8%, and Poland has grown at 4%. So they lose out. Polish top, of course, gains. As you can see, actually, the red line for Poland now is higher at the top than it was 30 years ago. So essentially what I want to actually indicate and show here is that the lower middle classes and middle classes of Europe would tend to lose their global position simply because their growth rates are likely to be inferior to the growth rates not only in China, but also in India, in the future, Thailand, and elsewhere. And in that sense, there is a major reshuffling of global income distribution. And for some, this is the case of the United States, where you see the same development at the bottom. There is an interesting case of Brazil, where the decline is in the middle of the income distribution of Brazil, because the poor people in Brazil, they were poor to start with, and they remain poor now. So there is not much of a change. The very rich people in Brazil, they were rich then, and they are very rich now. So again, there is no change for them. And finally, for example, for some countries, I took Croatia and Serbia as an example, the whole population shifts down because they are all within the range of Chinese increase. Even the people at the top, which you have seen in Italy and Germany, are not affected. Here, the people in the top are not sufficiently rich, so they also get affected and their position slides downward. So this was what happened in the middle of the income distribution. And finally, and I will finish with this, with my presentation in a minute, the global top 1%, however, was not affected by this reshuffling very much because it is very, very rich. So it's going to take some time for Chinese population and others to be more significantly represented at the very top. As you can see here in the slide, 82% of the people in the global top 1% are from Western Europe, North America, or Australia and New Zealand. Some countries, especially small countries that are rich, have a large chunk of their population in the global top 1%. Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, Luxembourg, but also the United States, with 11 or 12% of the US citizens being in the top 1%. So when people speak of the top 1% and demonstrate in the US, many of them are actually in the global top 1%, many of the demonstrators. They may not be in the US top 1%, but they're in the global top 1%. And this is simply to just show you the fact that actually about 40% of the people who are in that global top 1% come from the US. And for the first time now, we have in 2018, a significant representation of China. About 5% in that global top 1% are Chinese. You see still Germany with 7.9, very significant representation. Britain, 4.5, Japan, 5.6. So the traditionally rich countries are still dominant countries, but we do have, for the first time, a sort of the emergence in the sort of appearing in that select group of significant numbers of people from China. But the effects are not nearly as strong as the effects on the middle class, simply because the top 1% and the top classes are actually much richer, and they are not within the range of the Chinese incomes. So this is what really what I call the greatest reshuffling in relative income positions since the Industrial Revolution means. And that reshuffling, and that's the end of my talk, will continue. Now, the reshuffling will continue because Asian rates of growth are likely to be higher, with a caveat that I mentioned before, that with these three crises, we really don't know how things would evolve. And another caveat, which is very important, China will not play the role of global equality equalizer anymore, because it has become sufficiently rich that its further growth is no longer inequality reducing. So the most important growth for the future of the world equality has to come from India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, putting all three countries together, and large countries, populous countries in Africa. And unfortunately, when I look at the record of African growth over the last 50 years, you really have no countries, with the exception of Ethiopia, who are large in terms of population and who have grown by, let's say, 5% per annum for more than 5 years. So African growth becomes absolutely a condition of condition sine qua non for the reduction of global inequality, and especially so because Africa is the only continent in the world where we expect an increase in population. So Africa needs to grow fast, and the difficult part will be to grow fast when your population, which means young population, is rapidly increasing. So let me finish with that note about the future, because I think we have a big change in what needs to be sort of done in terms of for the global inequality to go down. Africa, I think, really comes to the fore of our interest in the 21st century. So thanks a lot, and I will be very happy to listen to Q&As or to comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Branko. Let's go over to the questions and answers. The first question is, would it be possible to send the PowerPoint slides after the presentation, or make it available somewhere?
That's an easy question. I will say yes. I will send you the PowerPoint, and everybody can use it whatever they want. Just mention that the source, but other than that, it's fine.
All right. The second question is there a publication available which includes these charts, these figures?
Yes, actually, my working paper is available. I'll send you the link as well. It is now submitted for publication. It is in the process, but the working paper version is on the net. It's on my website with the Graduate Center, City University of New York, but I can also send you the link.
What is the, you just say what the link is for those who want to look in quickly?
I cannot remember the exact words, but if you write, my name and you write Graduate Center, City University of New York, it would come.
All right, very good. So we're having problems getting questions in. So I'll start, I have some of my own. Going back, there was a question of alternatives, and I think we're experiencing one where the West is trying to roll back the Chinese economy, which was alternative A in comparison to taxing their own super rich. Is that possible? You are something of a China expert in the meantime. Can you roll back the Chinese economy?
I actually agree with you that what basically we're witnessing is the attempt to undo globalization, because it just turned out that the globalization effects seem to favor China. And I think it's deeply concerning from anybody who has some kind of a more cosmopolitan point of view, because what China has accomplished is something that nobody in the history of the world has accomplished. There was like 40 years of growth of 1.4 billion people, which has transformed the country. And even if you look at the previous episodes of growth, be it Japanese or the American in the 19th century, early 20th century, or even the Industrial Revolution, they were not so massive in terms of people, nor did they last so long. So I think globally speaking, what happened in China and India and elsewhere is really hugely good for the world. So should we now sort of try to stop that because of geopolitical concerns and reasons? And I believe, no, that actually we should not. However, politically, of course, I think this is something which is happening. Whether it would slow down China, I think it's quite possible. I think also China would slow down by a very fact that it has become richer now. And it's, of course, easier to grow when you're trying to, if you manage to start to have institutions and education system to grow when you're far from the frontier of technological development. It's much harder when you're at the frontier. So China would necessarily slow down. So I'm not surprised that China would slow down. The question is, does it make sense to make it even more difficult for China to grow? And I don't believe that it makes sense. But, you know, the powers that be seem to believe that that's how it should be done.
Just a follow-up question on that. Michael Pettis, I'm sure you know, keeps making the point that China has really not put much priority on its domestic market. That means if the exports are reduced through policies from Western nations trying to stultify the Chinese economy, how strong can that domestic market be?
You know, I don't know. I have to say that for me, there's always been a little bit of a, how should I say, mystery why China is really unable, because I think now it's unable, not only unwilling, to expand domestic consumption. China is very unusual in the sense that it has a domestic consumption as being only about 40% of GDP, whereas in the US and in Western countries, it is 70%. I don't think that it's impossible to increase that. I think the Chinese government is now sort of trying to do that. So as I said, it is a little bit of a puzzle for me. We are really facing many puzzles here. China has really thrown a lot of puzzles at us, including the very fact that China is no longer poor, but it used to be a poorer country, is financing the government expenses or actually buying the treasury bills of the richest country. You know, in the past, it used to be that the flow of money, of capital would go from the rich country to a poor country. With China, it has become really a reverse. China at one point had, I think, more than 1 trillion invested in US treasuries. So these are really new developments to, you know, compared to what was happening historically.
All right, so the questions are coming in. Someone would like to know how and whether you consider neoliberalism and your presentation compatible, whatever that means.
Neoliberalism and what else?
Is it compatible with your presentation with regard to the change in the relationships of inequality internationally?
Okay, there I would really like to make 2 points which I think are important for people to sort of see and to realize. First of all, there is so much talk about inequality, and of course I'm a great beneficiary of that talk as well, because I've been working on inequality for many years. But when we speak of inequality most of the time, we speak of inequality within nation states. And indeed, in many countries, since neoliberal policies, that inequality has gone up. Most recently, it is kind of stabilized, but certainly if you compare US today and US in 1970s, UK today and UK 1970s, even Sweden today, in Sweden 1970s, inequality is much higher now. So there is a legitimate concern with inequality. What people don't often realize is that the global inequality, as I was showing today, has gone down because the main element which drives global inequality is not so much inequalities within nation states, it is much more inequality between the states, between the countries, between nation states. And that's where China and India and others come into the play. And that's why we have at the same time reduced global inequality and increases within national inequality. So this is the point which is important. Now, what does it have to do with neoliberalism? It has to do with neoliberalism and its two aspects. The aspect of neoliberalism at the national level has certainly been to exacerbate inequalities. The effect of neoliberalism, if you actually see the globalization as the result of neoliberalism, was on the global level to reduce global inequality thanks to the growth rates or growth or rise of Asia. So these are really two different things. I know it's not sometimes easy to keep them all in mind, but they are two different things. And a neoliberalism through globalization was relatively favorable force, and neoliberalism domestically was a fairly unfavorable force.
All right, the next question is a bit odd, but is there the elephant graph from 1988 to 2018? How does that look like?
Oh, well, if it was to extend I did that as well. If you were to extend, you would still get a little bit of the both. The top 1% would not be going down as it did actually in the last 10 years. So there will be a little bit of an uptick at the very top. So you would still have some kind of a semi-elephant, but I think it's important to distinguish between these two periods. The high globalization period really ended with the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis affected rich countries, and rich countries are really preponderantly represented in the global top. So the second period, the next 10 years was different. And I think now we are in a yet different period. As I was saying before, we have no idea what kind of animal will come out in another 10 years. Who knows? What it would be, who knows? It could be a tiger or a rat or a snake.
Do you see the decline? Do you see the decline of the Western prosperity as a fact, or could there be policies that Western states may implement to avoid the decline of middle-class wealth income in their country?
I think that there are, certainly policies that would actually make incomes of the middle class and the lower middle class in rich countries higher. There is no doubt about that. Just think of the policies which would have to do with taxation, with social transfers, with education, with lower cost of private schools. There is no doubt that the position would be improved. And there is no doubt that actually the top 1% or top 5% would lose in the rich countries. But on the other hand, I cannot visualize exactly globally the ability of the West to maintain positions that it had for 200 years, simply because the change which started with the opening up of China is so big, and whatever you do, you actually would have to compete with significant increases in Asian incomes, which are running, as I said, to 7-8% per year. So that's not easy, but it's not possible even. But certainly you can change the position of the middle classes in the rich countries through all these domestic policies that I mentioned. And of course, people know them and it's well known and these policies work, but there is no political will and ability to do them.
All right. If current trends continued into the future, when would the Western top 1% of today struggle to hold its relative global income position?
It's a very difficult question. It could take, let's make a guess, 20 years. But I think that if we can imagine somehow the continuation of globalization more or less as it is now. Certainly large countries. You know what is interesting about China and India and actually other countries, Indonesia that we forget, or Vietnam, more than 100 million people, is that they are big countries. So when the significant numbers of people position improve, their position improves by entering into the domain, quote unquote, where you had Western middle classes. The Western middle classes you have seen in the case of Italy shifts down relatively precipitously because there are lots of people. You know, if we are talking about a small country becoming rich, I mean, make a sort of extreme example, Seychelles, it's not going to change the position of people in Western Europe. But Indonesia or Thailand, and let alone, of course, big countries like China and India do change. So I think in that sense, I see this process as continuing, but not at the same speed, simply because I think Chinese growth rate would actually become much more moderate. And we don't know what will happen with India, obviously.
Do you have an explanation for China's success? And do you see the demographic changes in Chinese population as a possible stop to Chinese growth or hindrance?
I just saw today that China, for the first time, registered negative decline in population, so the negative rate of growth of population since 1962. And I think 1962 was due to the Great Leap Forward and actually famine. Okay, let me put it like that. For China, I do believe, like most economists do, that China's growth rate will slow, will become less. I would expect that growth rate would be around 4%, which is a fairly high growth rate. If it does remain 4% on per capita basis, it would be still higher rate of growth than the US and Western Europe. So the catch up of China will, I think, continue. China does have demographic problems, as we all know, aging of the population, relatively underdeveloped system of social transfers, particularly in the rural areas. So these are all realistic problems. On the other hand, I think China, by being pushed to develop and to move into the area of high technology, and it has done pretty well in several areas, would be, I think, actually able to continue this unusual jump where it went from exporting relatively simple products to really becoming an exporter of very high-tech products. And I just would like to mention to people when they watched the World Cup this last December, you probably have noticed a number of Chinese advertisements. And this is very different because the World Cup plays to the world. The European leagues, despite the fact that they get money from all over the world, and they have even betting in Vietnam advertised on, I think, Man United games, you still have European-based or Western-based advertisements. But at the world level, you actually had many more Chinese and Indian than elsewhere.
So let me pop in one of my questions in between, because I think it's important for the last question. What about the productivity growth in China and Asia in comparison to the West?
I still think that actually the growth rates are higher, but they're definitely going down. I think that anybody who believes that China will continue to grow by 8% and that anything which is below 8% is somehow a disaster, I think that's totally unrealistic. It is China will have to slow down. It has just moved to a situation where, as I was saying before, is closer to the production possibility or technological frontier, and everybody has slowed down. The question is actually how far will it slow down? If there are some unusual events, like, for example, COVID, political disturbances, turmoil, war, then of course it can actually go and become negative. But I think under the normal conditions, I would expect productivity and GDP per capita to continue growing at around 4%.
All right, next question. Regarding the elephant graph, isn't the level from which the growth of Asian middle classes starts pretty low, the starting level of the growth of the top 1% very high?
Absolutely. And of course, that graph, to some extent, you can say is misleading because it does work. It shows everything in relative terms. In other words, like all inequality statistics, they're always relative in the sense that the elephant graph shows the increase in percents. But if I were to take, and I actually did, if you look at the paper that we did, if you take the elephant graph and unpack it and say, okay, let me show you absolute gains. The absolute gains at the top are enormous. The absolute gains, even in the graph where you actually do not have the elephant anymore, the gains in absolute terms at the top are still the largest because the top is so much ahead of everybody else. So if I have 1 million and I have a growth of 1%, you know, it is going to give me, what is this, 10,000. So it is going to give me a lot of money compared to somebody who starts with, you know, $1,000 and has 100% growth. So, you know, it is actually the absolute gains, of course, are extremely high at the top, but relative, and as I said, we always work with relatives in inequality, the relatives were much, much lower.
The next question. So did I understand correctly that you would prefer as a policy target to redistribute between the top 1% and the middle class within a country rather than between countries? God knows what happened to the lower class.
Yes, I think I would prefer that because the other possibility is really undoing globalization or creating trade blocks. I'm not sure that would work. I think actually it would have significant negative impact on global poverty reduction and obviously on global inequality reduction. And, you know, people who have actually come arguing for that, Rana Farrokhar and the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, by calling it friendshoring, they're de facto introducing new politically based economic blocks. And I really wonder how that the explanation, how they would plan to explain that to international organizations that were based precisely on the elimination of trade barriers, open markets, equal treatment, at least in theory, equal treatment of everybody else. How would you go to Nigeria and say, well, we have created a trade bloc and we don't want you to create your own trade bloc? I think it has really major implications how we see the role of international organizations in the future.
All right, last question, but I'll have one at the end. Are we experiencing a time when a repetition of the rise of the leveled middle class society that took place in North America and Europe after World War II is taking place on a global level? And does that mean, in a sense, that the world is growing together?
Yes, I think both of that, I would say yes and yes. The difference actually, and it's a very interesting difference, and nobody has an answer to that, is what is the meaning of the global middle class? You know, we actually, when we talk about middle class within country, since Aristotle, we are actually seeing the middle class as a stabilizing force for a very simple reason. The middle class doesn't want to be ruled by the top, and consequently then wants to preserve some level of democracy or power to influence political decisions. And on the other hand, doesn't want to have its assets being taken by the poor. Consequently, it has to protect property. So that's why you get democracy and protection of property. But what happens at the global level? Global middle class has no political role because there is no global political association where they can play that role. So I really don't know. I think it's a very good question. Many of people who might listen to this might decide to actually write a dissertation or a topic on that. I don't know what is their role, other than having a similar consumption pattern and, you know, writing to each other on Facebook, on Twitter, or traveling to same events or buying the same iPhone. but I don't see politically what would be their role.
All right, there's one more question, which is exactly the question I was going to raise. You mentioned the three crises that you currently recognize. Why do you not include the climate crisis? I know this year in Europe, we really did see the economy being affected by the climate crisis. We had rivers that were not navigable. We had the nuclear energy plants that couldn't, had to be taken offline because the water was too hot in the rivers or there wasn't enough water. We're seeing this in agriculture because there's just no rain. We're going through droughts. We're seeing it really in many, many aspects. Is that?
Yeah, it is. Matthew, it's a very good question. People have also asked this question, for example, in capitalism alone. There is almost no discussion of climate change. Let me try to answer that. First, compared to the three crises that I mentioned, climate crisis is a longer-term crisis. It just did not appear. You know, the three crises that I mentioned have appeared 3 years ago. When we met, as you mentioned, when I last time had a talk at the same place and it was in person. The reason why I was able to have it in person is because there was no COVID. So this was really a major external shock. The war between Russia and Ukraine is a major external shock. The trade war, de facto, between the US and China is a major shock. Climate problems have actually, climate change or climate issues have been around for much longer. So that's one reason. Secondly, I don't see that immediacy of the climate is as high as the war. You know, the war can actually mean that tomorrow we are all dead. The climate change does not mean that we will be dead tomorrow. And third is that I'm what you can call technological optimist. I do believe that with a combination of economic policies, right incentives, right taxes, you could actually make a significant dent and control climate change. I will not go into that. This is not my area, but I actually believe that people are economic animals. And so if you were to seriously tax goods that are producing most of carbon dioxide, you would actually essentially lead to lower consumption of that. So I believe it's doable. I don't think that actually people want to do that. I think many of people talk about that, but they do very little because essentially their standard of living would have to decline significantly. They would have to eat much less meat, travel much less, heat offices much less, or use air conditioning much less, drive much less, and many of them, they don't want to do that.
Yes, that's definitely the problem. Branko, let's stop here for tonight. And I'd like to thank you very, very much for taking the time to hold this talk. And we'll chat anyway soon.
Well, thank you again. It was a pleasure. As I said, I would like to say again, I would send a PowerPoint. You can find easily the link. You can also follow me on Twitter, and you can, I hope, also contribute to Brave New Europe, which has been such an outstanding place where one could actually read and publish things that would be very difficult to find elsewhere. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope the next time I can actually be with you in person in Berlin.
Right. And for those of you, just to catch on that, please consider donating. I don't even know if many of you know Brave New Europe. It's a website, a very progressive one, and also posts things that just aren't being posted anywhere else, especially in mainstream media currently. So yeah, feel free to have a look in. That's www.braveneweurope.com. And then I can only repeat, make a contribution, help out, improve our media. You're certainly going to need it because the rubbish you're getting on mainstream media right now, this is, I've never seen anything quite like this right now. So do consider donating. There's a donate button. Otherwise, I hope we'll see each other in February. What was the date then? February 6th with Claire Daly. It's, as I said, going to also be a very interesting talk. And if you're in Berlin, living here or visiting, do drop in. If you've donated, as I said, you're our guest. I thank you very much, and we'll see each other in 4 weeks.
Thank you very much.
Franco, bye.
Thank you.